In this video, we're going to explore some basic concepts within liberation theology, looking specifically at Gutierrez and Boff, with a brief dip into Oscar Romero and Camilo Torres. In terms of A-level syllabus, this is the EDUCAS RS A-level, section theme 4. Religious practices that shape identity, and this is section F, Liberation Theology. We'll start by placing liberation theology in the overall context of what we're looking at, which is the trend towards reunification of the church, which started in the 19th century, and we're looking at the 20th century impact of this. And so that's the reversal of that pattern of splitting from Great Schism, approximately 1000, then Reformation 1500, and then that fragmentation within the Protestant Church, and then looking at how that started to reverse and the church is coming back together. And so the liberation theology fits in this bottom-up element of it. And so this is individual Christians who are confronted just existentially with social issues in their local community. They band together with other Christians and potentially others who are not Christian to deal with that problem that they can see is there. And in doing so, what they find is that they're working alongside people of different denominations, and their denominational differences really cease to matter when they're caring for the homeless, caring for the elderly, caring for disadvantaged children, whatever it might be. They're confronted with poverty and social issues, sometimes political issues, and they're working across denominations. And so that helps them to form friendships, seek to find that which they agree on, and therefore that brings denominations close together. The denominational allegiance actually is of far less importance than what unites them in the focus on their particular issue. Now, of course, those individual Christians, many of those will be in some sort of leadership, just from sort of local lay leadership right up to being senior clergy, senior officials within the denominations. And that means those individuals are taking to that top-down institutional church thinking on ecumenism. As they're sitting around in their committees, as they're writing their reports, they are people as individuals who have experienced working across denominations at their local level, and so therefore they are very willing to facilitate initiatives at that bottom-up level. They would be working to break down barriers between denominations because they've seen how much more effective Christians can be when working together. And of course that bottom up is not just one. It is not just that there are people who are responding to poverty and injustice, who are breaking down barriers between denominations, and there are others who are having religious experiences, particularly sort of charismatic experiences, which unites them. There's no reason at all why that can't be a both and so you've got people who are within the charismatic tradition, and therefore they've got that breaking down of denominational barriers there. They are also people working in response to poverty and injustice, and so they're breaking down barriers there. And so this reuniting of the church is a two-way. You've got these bottom up, where Christians at local level are finding unity in what they are doing and their experiences, which transcend denominational barriers. And they are themselves at times people who are involved at the institutional level in churches, and therefore feeding back down into local churches, facilitating initiatives to reunite the church and break down barriers where possible. Looking at the EDUCAS syllabus then, the content of this is looking at the basis, looking at the political, ethical and religious basis of liberation theology, looking at this in a South American context, which is where it's usually studied and where it's usually seen to have started, looking at the work of Gutierrez and Boff, and then looking at the Roman Catholic response to this South American liberation theology. Some foundational questions then as we go into this, which you need to hold in your mind as you think about liberation theology. One of them is, what is the purpose of the church? Another one, which is really absolutely central, is how and where do Christians do their theology? And closely linked to that, what are the starting points for theology and practice in the church? There's another set of ideas then around the poor, because liberation theology is very much about the poor. And so this is about, well, why are people poor? And you need to be careful that you look at this in different contexts. The answer to the question why are people poor in UK is not the same as the answer to why people are poor in less developed countries, in Africa, say, and a different answer again in South American context. So why are people poor? Are they poor because of their own sin? Are they poor because of the structures, the societal and political structures, which enable the wealthy and the powerful to exploit the poor and keep them in poverty? So that's a range of questions then which need to be held in mind as we go into this topic. So the first place to start with this is, how do we do theology? And a part of that is, where physically do we do theology, and what are the methods used in doing theology? We'll start with the traditional method of doing theology. And the traditional method is, you go to a theological college, it might be called a seminary, but it's a standard educational model, and so the images here are symbols of that. What you do, you go to lectures, you have seminars, you sit in a library full of books, you sit and you read, you write essays, you discuss, and it's all set in the context of the church with its round of services, the liturgical structure. We're looking at this particularly within the Roman Catholic Church, but it wouldn't be that much different. Methodist colleges, I'm not actually sure there are any of those left anymore. Baptist colleges, they would be the same. It is very much the traditional model, has always been this lecture, library, essay, and set within a framework of church services through the day. And so we'll call that one the traditional theology method. And what you do there, you start with theory, you start with your books, you start with your ideas, you start with your reading of church history, and you write your essays. And eventually then, when you go what would be called sort of out into ministry, when you leave college, get ordained, and start working in a church, then you are out into practice. Now, liberation theology in many ways reverses that, and this is an absolutely fundamental element of liberation theology. And so this is about doing your theology with the poor. So you're not in a theological college at all. What you're doing is, you firstly immerse yourself in the poor. Your first step is an existential response to the call of Jesus to be with the poor, to help the poor, and therefore you go and you are alongside them, and so you're living with the poor. You're identifying the issues of the poor, not because you're reading some working party report on it, but because you know these people, you are living with them, you're seeing it, and you are very, very existentially aware of what it's like to live with these people. You're worshipping with them. The church that you take part in and potentially have a leadership role in is actually embedded within these communities. And so this means that your theology starts with Praxis, that's a good sort of Marxist type term. In other words, it's the practice. You are completely immersed in the practical reality, the dirty, miserable, oppressed reality of the poor. That's your starting point, and responding to their needs. And then what you do later, you then reflect on this and you think, well, okay, so let's read the Bible now in the context of the poor, and maybe we'll come up with some sort of theoretical ideas coming out of this. But that's fairly secondary to just getting on and being with the poor and meeting the needs of them. So this then raises another couple of questions. Where does the church stand? Is the church part of the institutions? Is the church really aligned with the government, the powerful and rich elites, big business interests? Is that where the church is, relying on donations from them, giving good lavish weddings and baptisms and funerals for the rich and powerful elite? Is that where the church stands? Or does the church stand in solidarity with the poor, the oppressed, the persecuted and the exploited? And the people who are probably dirty and they smell when they come into the church, and they don't have polished manners, and they are a bit uncomfortable really when they engage in the rather middle class environment of many churches. We're going to look now at the Bible and liberation theology, and continuing to hold in mind this idea of where the Bible is studied. What is the perspective which is brought to the Bible? We're going to look at some key biblical passages and concepts, and very important biblical passage is the Exodus narrative. This is the account of the children of Israel have ended up as slaves in Egypt, and the story tells us that God liberated them. Moses led them out of Egypt, away from the oppression of the powerful Egyptians, and they were led out into the promised land and into freedom. The Old Testament prophets are also incredibly important for liberation theology. A major theme of the prophets is speaking out against the oppression of the poor by the rich. And again, we're looking at reading these passages. You're there in your library in a theological college, or you're there in your study as a minister, surrounded by your books, soaked in establishment church, and you read those passages. Or you read those passages living in some South American slum, where you've got people living, finding some shelter underneath a motorway, raised bit of motorway, and living in a shanty town. And read those passages in those contexts, and they probably are going to say something different to you. A couple of quotes from the Old Testament prophets. Here's one from Micah. He has told you, that's God. God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Again, how do those words land when you are in the top picture? You're there in your seminary library, studying the Bible there, comfort, you've got a nice meal coming up, you've got the shape of the day with your services with your friends. Or are you reading those words? Do those words land as you are there in the squalor of a South American slum? And a good one from Amos. These guys were not your sort of polite, these weren't liberal Democrats, these weren't the sort of nice, mildly spoken, gentle characters. Here's Amos. Hear this, you cows of Bashan, who are on Mount Samaria, who oppress the poor and crush the needy, who say to their husbands, oh, bring me something to drink. The Lord has sworn by his holiness, the time is surely coming upon you when they shall take you away with hooks, even the last of you with fish hooks through breaches in the wall. You shall leave each one straight ahead, and you shall be flung out into Harmon, says the Lord. And so again, you're reading those words in a comfortable, affluent environment, well fed, well clothed, warm, dry, safe. Or you're reading those words, living alongside the poor with all the squalor that goes with it, knowing full well that there's not that far away, there's millionaires living in gated communities. And staying with the Bible, but now moving on to Jesus and looking at our picture of Jesus. And that might mean literally the pictures we use to inform us about Jesus. So I've got two images on the slide here. One of them is our traditional church Jesus. There he is. He's on a throne. He's a ruler in heaven. He's surrounded by that gold-leafed frame. He's in a rich setting. He's comfortable. He's establishment, and he's very, very safe. And then this other one, this is a graphic novel or graphic Bible type presentation of Jesus. And this is Jesus driving out the money changers from the temple. And he gets this whip made out of cords and he drives out all the cattle and the sheep. He overturns the tables and generally upsets the temple establishment. So which of those pictures do you have in mind as you read the Bible? So here's a set of standard church pictures, a very safe Jesus. There's the nice Jesus in the manger. There he is born, and he's holy at that stage. He's just this glowing with holiness baby, stained glass Jesus. There's the Pieta. There's a pretty useless Jesus there because he's dead. He's there just cradled in the lap of Mary. And then you've got Jesus. This is the Jesus back on his throne again, ruling in heaven. And then on the right, you've got Jesus on the cross, Jesus being executed by the powers, the ruthless imperial powers of Rome, set up by the religious establishment and handed over to the secular authorities, who then just brutally killed him. But you've got that there, that's Jesus on the cross, but it's just look at it, it's all in this ornate setting. It's surrounded by gold and opulence, and it's not particularly real. There's not much sense there if you've got some stinking near corpse desperately in agony hanging on a cross with jeering crowds around him. Or is this your image of Jesus? I'm staying with the cleansing the temple because it's such a powerful image. This is, I might as well read it, John 2. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip out of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both sheep and cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." And so what's your image of Jesus? Is it this really safe ecclesiastical Jesus from the last slide? Or is it this dangerous character who could at any point walk into your safe establishment church and seriously disrupt the peace, the quiet, the tranquility, the traditions, the way you've always done it? And some teaching of Jesus. Here is an account. This is when he's starting his ministry. Right at the beginning, he's back in Nazareth, and he reads a portion of Isaiah. And so this again is drawing on the Old Testament prophets, and this is showing that Jesus clearly saw himself in the mold of those Old Testament prophets. And what did Jesus do? It's often called the Nazareth Manifesto. This is Jesus setting out at the beginning of his call it his ministry. He's moved on. He's left being this builder carpenter, and he's now going around as an itinerant preacher, teacher, upsetter of the establishment. And so he takes on these words of Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Okay, so what's he been called to do? What does he think that the Lord is going to lead him to do? He's anointed him, chosen one, the Christ. To do what? Well, to bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, let the oppressed go free. And he finishes it by saying, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing, which upset them somewhat. But there's Jesus clearly showing that that was his mission. And again, it's you read that passage, you read those words of Jesus in a South American slum, or you read them in the comfort of your church, the comfort of your theological college, and those words are likely to mean something quite significantly different. Jesus' story of the judgments and the king. This is the God character. So God has divided people up into two groups, and then there's the blessed ones. And God says to them, I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. A stranger, you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, you visited me. The righteous then are somewhat confused by this, and so they say to him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, thirsty, etc. And this is the incredibly important line here. The king will answer. This is the sort of the God character. Says, truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Now, in that line there, you've got a very powerful piece of theology, which is effectively saying that God is present with the poor and the oppressed in a way that is not present with the rich and the powerful. You help a poor person and you are directly helping God. And so again, very powerful passage that would land completely differently in a South American slum to in the comfort of the established church. And the Beatitudes as included in Luke. Blessed are you who are poor. Blessed are you who are hungry. Blessed are you who weep. Blessed are you when people hate you. And then woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are full. Woe to you who are laughing. Woe to you when all speak well of you. Now, there's you can sit in Bible studies and people wrestle with this. You read commentaries where it's wrestling with what this means. Now, I'm going to take a guess that if you are reading this in a South American slum and you read it and it says, blessed are you who are poor, it's not actually difficult to work out what that means. It means those who are poor, you're surrounded by them. You know exactly what poor people look like. Poor people are those who can't feed themselves. They go hungry, they go cold, they can't pay for medicine. They are the poor, and they're blessed. What does it mean when Jesus says, woe to you who are rich? Well, again, it's not really difficult to work out what that means. It's not difficult at all to work out what Jesus meant by it. And when you're there in your South American slum, it just stares you in the face. It screams very loudly and very clearly, exactly and very simply what Jesus meant. What he meant was, woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are full. Well, that's the problem with this, of course, is that's the middle class church. That is the establishment church, because the church is rich. The Roman Catholic Church is spectacularly rich. The Roman Catholic clergy and hierarchy and establishment, they're rich. They get food, they're comfortable, and it's woe to them. They're not poor, they're not hungry, and they're not weeping. And so where you are reading this, if you are reading this in a South American slum, the meaning is just incredibly clear. If you're reading this in a middle class and comfortable setting, you've got to try and work out how you can interpret that passage so you haven't got Jesus saying, woe to you, which isn't very comfortable for Christians. And moving on to the epistles, this is a section that Luther really did not like at all. But again, we've got that same theme that James is picking up. James, brother of Jesus, so he presumably knew what his brother was teaching and was constantly banging on about. So here we go. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but do not have works. In other words, he's saying, you're reading this in your South American slum, and that you're reading this, well, that's not difficult. What is it if you have faith? So all these, the church establishment, they say they've got faith, but what do? It's the crunch bit. If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill, and yet do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So your faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. So very simple. You're there in your South American slum, you're reading that, I think the church is pretty useless because all they do is bless you. They have nice rituals. They might provide comfort. People like it. But, there they are in the Vatican. They've got everything they possibly want. And they just nicely send, you get these papal blessings. You get messages which say to the South American poor, yes, go in peace. A nice blessing at the end. Well, actually, what the South American poor need is they need food. They need the political structures sorting out. They need the powerful to stand by them and try and lift them out of their poverty. So again, a very powerful passage, which is going to land quite differently if you are reading this in your theological college library, or you're you're doing your seminary training and you're writing an essay, and it's going to be about Luther, faith and works, and you're reading this and what's meant by faith and what's meant by works. But you're not going to read it like that in a South American slum. It's about people who are hungry, can't afford medicine, are cold, and are beaten up by the police. They need the help of the rich and the powerful. Very similar theme here then from, this is the first letter of John. Those who say, I love God, and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God, whom they have not seen. So again, it's about love and care for their brothers and sisters. We're now going to have a look at some of the people involved, some of the key players, the names that are associated with liberation theology. A really absolutely foundational character is Gutierrez, still around as far as I know, born 1928. He's Peruvian. He's a educated man, philosopher, theologian, Dominican priest. So he's part of the establishment, well and truly part of the establishment. And he's generally considered to be one of the founders of liberation theology. There's great establishment credentials. Studied medicine first, medicine and literature, National University of San Marco. He became involved there. This is a slightly divergent to a normal path through, but he's got there's this organisation called Catholic Action, which is laity, which of course in the Roman Catholic Church laity didn't really account for much, but this is a group of lay Catholics attempting to be involved in influence on society. So that's at the very least nudging in the direction of political action. Came to Europe, studied the Leuven in Belgium and Lyon in France. So there he is, member of the establishment. That's very important because he needed that to be listened to. And the starting point really for his work was this idea of preferential option for the poor. That's obviously in English. And that's really rooted in that passage from Matthew that we looked at earlier, when God in that story divides the people into the righteous and the unrighteous. And you've got that line, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. That idea that God is somehow present with the poor in ways that he isn't with the rich. And so that was phrased then, preferential option for the poor. When the Church of England was working on this very much in the 80s and looking at it in terms of the urban poor in England, then the term used there was bias to the poor, exactly the same sort of idea. And that is the absolute starting point. It's a from the bottom, it's a praxis, upwards model. You work alongside the poor, you see the poor, you see the needs of the poor, you see God present in the poor, demanding that you respond to God, to the poor, and then you come up with this preferential option for the poor. And all your theology then hangs on that. And really the question then for Gutierrez is, he's with all these poor people who seem to be ignored by the church. The poor, they might turn up at services, but they just sort of stand at the back. They're not part of the church. The priests don't seem to care much about them. They look at all this gold and ornate. Now, of course, they liked that because it gave them a glimpse of something better, a sort of glimpse of heaven, but it didn't do much for them in terms of how they lived now on day-to-day basis. So Gutierrez is then working out, okay, how do you convince the poor that God loves them when there's not much evidence of that from the church? And Gutierrez then came up with really ways of engaging with the Bible that ended up with him being pretty critical of the social and economic injustice he saw in South America. And this goes back to why are people poor? Gutierrez said, as he looked at the poor in South America, then he was saying this is about structural inequality. This is about the way that the politics have organised the society to enable the rich to remain rich and the poor to be kept in poverty because it benefits the rich. And it's incredibly important not to perceive poverty in a UK perspective. In the UK, you've got you just don't have that level of injustice. There's a very comprehensive social security system. There's free at point of use health care. So completely different. The reasons that people might end up as right at the bottom of the heap in UK, it's free education as well. The reasons people might end up at the bottom of the heap in UK is completely different to the reasons in South America, and this is being worked out very much in a South American context, and that's how it has to be seen. And Gutierrez was also very critical of the Roman Catholic hierarchy because he saw them very much on the side of the establishment. Needless to say, that didn't go down very well with the Roman Catholic hierarchy. So major theme for Gutierrez was he didn't just want to help individual poor people. Church can be good at that sometimes. You're going to give them food parcels. You might have a medical centre where you are treating the illnesses and the injuries. Gutierrez said that's not actually adequate because what's needed is to change the structures of society which are causing poverty, which are preventing the poor from ever leaving their poverty. And so it was at the structural level that Gutierrez wanted to work. And he's got this institute that he founded in 1974. Mission statement then aims to use theology as a means of addressing contemporary social issues and educating through research, engagement with lawmakers and collaboration with grassroots organisation. Now that's not usually what you'd see the study of theology for. So going back to where are you doing your theology, what's the purpose of the church? If you're there sitting in your library writing your essays in your training, or you are then a parish priest and you're sitting in your study with all your books and you're reading your theology books, then why are you doing that? Probably not in order that you can have this engagement with lawmakers in order to change society. And so this is again really just coming round again. We keep coming back to this idea of where are you doing your theology, why are you doing your theology, and the context really powerfully shapes the theology that you end up with and your understanding of the purpose of the church. Okay, moving on then to Leonardo Boff, born 1938, so 10 years younger than Gutierrez, and as far as I know, again, he's still around. He's Brazilian, so again, South American, theologian, philosopher, writer, and again, one of the players in Liberation Theology. And at the point that I made this PowerPoint, he was at that stage Professor Emeritus of Ethics, Philosophy of Religion and Ecology in Rio de Janeiro. Now, just note that the ecology bit in there, because that might not normally be thought of as going with that, mainly because it's not normally seen as a branch of philosophy. So you've got moral philosophy and philosophy of religion. They go together very well. I mean, that's that's 2/3 of religious studies A-level courses. They are just absolutely what you'd expect. And then suddenly you've got ecology in there. And so he's somebody who is wanting to broaden out the usual focus of what is the study of theology. And Boff again works with this idea of preferential option for the poor, bias to the poor as the foundation. Now, particular interest to Boff was what's known as base ecclesial communities, and they're very often associated with him. And this really is asking, what is the church? And so we're going to just reflect now on the church. What do we mean by that? And the two images on the screen here, top right, I assume that's the Vatican, and they're mainly cardinals. In other words, that's the top layer of the administration of the Roman Catholic Church. And this is predominantly a Roman Catholic issue, so that's why this is a focus on that. So we start with the Vatican. There it is, just priceless paintings. Just look at the scale of that room, the art within it, the riches that are presented there. You've got all these very comfortably off men, and you know there'll be the refreshments through the day at that conference are going to be pretty good. They're all very comfortable, they're well fed, they're completely safe, they are highly educated, they are not at risk really from anybody. They are, in many ways, they can be perceived as the rich and the powerful. And so that's the church, capital T, capital C, the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy represented by the Vatican. Okay, and then left-hand image is a base ecclesial community. So that's the local Christians on the ground in a particular locality. So we're looking at what is the church, where is the church, what's it supposed to be doing, and again we just keep coming back around to this basic concept of liberation theology, that if you are this bunch of men here and they are doing Bible study at some point during the day, how are the Bible passages, those passages from Exodus, the prophets, those gospel passages, how are they going to land with those men compared to being read in the context of the poor? So here's the base ecclesial community. Now this is it's pretty bread and butter stuff in many churches. It was a bit new in the Roman Catholic Church. This, for example, looking at Methodism, this Methodism was just based on this. That's what the Wesley brothers did. The Wesleys set up these small groups. That's how the Methodist Church grew. They identified leaders, what were called class leaders, and the class leaders then were in charge of about a dozen people, and they nurtured them and supported them, and that was how the church grew. Methodism's a fairly non-clerically orientated denomination. There are ordained ministers, but predominantly it's hugely lay-led church. I qualified I started training as a Methodist preacher, lay preacher, when I was about 19. I hate to think the quality of the services I used to lead at that age, but I was fully qualified lay leader within the church, lay preacher, by the time I was 21. And that sort of model is very common within the Protestant church. You find it in home groups where the church will meet on a Sunday as the whole community. And then during the week there'll be a midweek meeting, Bible study, prayer, general support. And so lots and lots of Protestant churches, this is just bread and butter. The home group, the small group, and it's called a home group because it meets in people's homes. And there's no clergy involved at all. It's lay led, and the clergy might give some input. The lay leader might in fact be in charge of working out what they're going to be studying, because what they're going to do is, well, what does this group particularly need now? And tends to be lots of support. So home groups I've been part of, somebody has a baby and the home group then just form a rota, so food is taken round. That's what my wife and I experienced when we had our children. The home group then just basically fed us for a week or so, which was a great help. Practical support, mending cars for people, giving them lifts or whatever it might be. And that's bread and butter in the Protestant church. It's pretty radical stuff in the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church is very, very church leadership, ordained leadership led. The priest is absolutely central to everything that goes on. So these basic ecclesial communities were deeply threatening to the Roman Catholic Church, because these people were just getting on their own. You look at that picture there, there's no priest there. Typical home group, somebody's got a guitar, they'll turn up, they'll play the guitar, they'll sing, they'll read the Bible together, they'll pray together. And of course there's no priest to tell them how they are supposed to interpret the Bible, and what they're supposed to believe, what they're supposed to be doing. And of course these home groups, because they're completely and utterly rooted in the community, the basic ecclesial community is completely rooted in the wider community. They know exactly what the needs are, and they would tend to be people, they would be literate, and if they weren't literate to start with, they could develop their literacy. They would develop confidence as they discussed, they gained confidence in working with ideas. Methodist Church was profoundly influential on the early trade union movement and the early Labour Party, because these were the educated working classes, not formally educated, that were educated through being part of the Methodist Church. And similar with these South American base ecclesial communities, a great place to nurture and give confidence to people so they can speak out on behalf of the poor. And that's who they are the poor, meeting in each other's homes, but profoundly threatening to the Roman Catholic establishment. They're not taking mass, they're turning up and having services effectively which aren't a mass, which is not really very common in the Catholic Church. And so there's the Catholic Church then danger that they could see, the hierarchy, is that these people, they were becoming Protestants, they were just doing their own thing. They were meeting around the Bible to just see what the Bible said to them. It was just God speaking to them directly through the Bible, God speaking to them directly through their times of prayer and worship without the intermediary of the priest. Not taking the sacrament. Was there a danger that these people would decide that actually they didn't really need to go to church to receive the sacrament from the priest, that it wasn't really that important? And again, you'd find that in the Protestant Church. Methodism is not big on the Eucharist, nor are the other the Protestant churches, Baptists, Independents, that sort of thing. It's all about meeting together for prayer and for Bible study. And of course the Protestant church is present within South America, very strong Pentecostal churches there, and these basically ecclesial communities will be seeing these other churches, these other denominations, these Protestant groups doing this sort of thing. They could learn from them, potentially even working alongside them in terms of the social action within those communities. And all that is very deeply threatening to the church establishment, that Roman Catholic establishment. If you just cast your minds back to the previous slide with those hierarchy of the Vatican, were profoundly threatened by base ecclesial communities. Let's look at another two characters. These are not in the EDUCAS syllabus, but are worth looking at and help give us a flavour of liberation theology beyond those two, and also help us to understand the Roman Catholic response to it. So I'm going to look at Camilo Torres and Oscar Romero. We'll start with Camilo Torres, not a particularly well-known figure unless you studied Christian Marxism in the 70s as part of your degree, which I did. Christian Marxism at that point was quite fashionable. So here's Camilo Torres, and he represents in many ways one of the dangers that the Roman Catholic Church saw with liberation theology. Camilo Torres, Roman Catholic priest, embedded, well and truly embedded with the poor, really wanted to change the structures of society that led to people being poor. So it's all very basic. Liberation theology, start with the praxis, go to the theory. What Camilo Torres then did, however, and this is the step which most people within the Christian church probably would consider is too far, is he decided that the only possible way of changing the structures was by armed revolt. So Camilo Torres then threw in his lot with the local armed rebels, Marxist-based rebel group, and he then just became this revolutionary Marxist. And so the problem here is, and this is a criticism from the Roman Catholic Church, very, very acute with Torres and hovering in the background with those other people we've looked at, and the whole liberation theology movement is, are we losing the Christianity? Are we just being Marxists and the Bible has just been pushed quietly to one side? Or in fact, the only bits of the Bible that are read are the ones which actually prop up the Marxism? Is all our praxis going to be determined by Marxism, and the Catholicism bit, the Christian bit, is only going to come in when it doesn't get in the way of the Marxism? Anyway, Camilo Torres, I mean, he was serious. He was killed in action when his unit was involved in a firefight with a Colombian military patrol. Now, one quote from Camilo Torres, which is worth looking at because it does show how profoundly easy it is to end up in profound error when you get so completely embedded within the poor community and then just get so embedded in the idea that Marxism is the way out. Revolutionary Marxism using military means is the way out. So here's a quote from Camilo Torres. If Jesus were alive today, he would be a guerrillero. In other words, he would be a guerrilla fighter. So Camilo Torres was justifying his joining of that group by saying that if Jesus was alive today, that's exactly what he would have done. He would have taken up arms and fought. There is a major snag with that line, however. The snag is that being a guerrillero, being a guerrilla fighter, it was a live option open to Jesus. There were no shortage of freedom fighters in Jesus' time, particularly in Galilee. These were the zealots, so these are the freedom fighters as far as the large portion of the Jews were concerned. As far as the Romans were concerned, they were just terrorists. Some of the wealthy Jewish establishment thought they were terrorists as well. Jesus not only could have thrown his lot in with them, he could have been a zealot leader. We have an account of the people wanting to make Jesus their king, that he would have been welcomed with open arms as a leader of that zealot cause. But Jesus did not take that option. In fact, it was the other way around. One of the disciples, known as Simon the Zealot, to distinguish him from the other Simon, he was clearly an ex-zealot. He'd been there. He'd been one of these revolutionary freedom fighters and had decided instead to follow Jesus. So unfortunately, there's no evidence at all that Camilo Torres is correct. And in fact, there's evidence to say, no, Jesus wouldn't have been guerrillero because he had that option open to him and rejected it. He did not become a zealot. He did not become a freedom fighter for the Jews. He was not prepared to be their leader. Okay, looking then now at Oscar Romero, different character. He's now a saint, so clearly accepted by the Roman Catholic establishment, and he was assassinated by the government. So another Roman Catholic priest who was killed by the government, but a completely different attitude to him by the Roman Catholic establishment. So Oscar Romero was in many ways part of the establishment. He was the Archbishop, and he was there, therefore mixing with the great and the good in El Salvador, and it was a pretty brutal time in El Salvador. There's a really oppressive, sort of fascist regime in place, military regime, and they stopped at nothing. They would happily kill, torture anybody who got in their way. Oscar Romero trod that difficult line between being part of the establishment, being very much the man of the church. So he didn't take Camilo Torres' route. He stayed well within the established church, but also very clearly spoke out against the injustices that were being inflicted by the establishment, by the rich, the powerful, by the political class, on the poor. And of course, it was in speaking out against that, in standing against that injustice, that he was assassinated. Nobody's actually been convicted of the death, but generally accepted that this was the government. So the government just had him shot, as opposed to Camilo Torres, who was involved in a military engagement and was killed in a firefight with government forces. Oscar Romero simply killed to get him out of the way because he was uncomfortable to the political establishment. He was canonized recently then, October 2018. Pope Francis canonized him, so he's now Saint Oscar Romero. There's a good film of Oscar Romero, which gives a very good picture of his life, of what it was like living under that fascist regime in El Salvador at the time. Now, the Roman Catholic Church response to South American liberation theology is very complex, very nuanced. There's a document, I'll put a link below. It's a pretty weighty tome full of lots of very, very carefully worded theology, fairly typical Roman Catholic piece of writing, very carefully worded. And so it's incredibly difficult to then give, what is the response? The response changed over time, and the response is very nuanced and balanced. But I think the response can be seen very much in looking at Camilo Torres and Oscar Romero. One of them is just essentially forgotten, and the other one was made a saint, and so therefore clearly the exact opposite of being forgotten. And let's look at what was the Roman Catholic Church concerned about. I mean, there's some very legitimate concerns with liberation theology. One of those concerns is the Marxist analysis. In other words, why are you having to use Marx? What is it that Marx is bringing to much of liberation theology? And whereas there might be some elements of Marx which make sense, the danger is if you go down that Christian Marxist line, then the tendency is you start with Marx and you use your Marxist analysis, and you've basically ditched the Bible. The Bible only ever comes in when it can be used then to prop up your Marxist analysis. And that's a real danger. And the sort of more extreme end of that is the Camilo Torres model, where he just goes, I mean, he was just effectively a straight down the line Marxist with this thin veneer of Christian over the top of it. And the Roman Catholic theologians would say, well, no, that's wrong. You've got to, you're not, there might be insights possibly from Marx, and Roman Catholic theology might need to be modified and tweaked and revised, but it's got to remain as Christian theology. And so that was one very valid challenge to liberation theology. The Vatican was very happy with some elements of liberation theology because it was thoroughly rooted in biblical theology and church tradition. And so what they were saying really is that liberation theology is nothing new. All it's doing is just bringing to the fore, giving a bit more emphasis on that which is already there, present within the Roman Catholic tradition, within biblical theology. There was also concern of biblical passages being treated entirely politically. So the Exodus narrative was being read purely as a political passage without the spiritual idea of being liberated from sin and freedom with God. Now, of course, this is a major question, because this is what the liberation theologians were challenging, that far too much of the Bible had been spiritualized when actually it was originally political. So it's a discussion that always goes on within the church, is to just how much of the Bible you just take at very straightforward face value, and which of it you then turn into a spiritual message. And the church has had a habit of spiritualizing lots of things, which when they were originally written, originally spoken, had a very clear political edge to them. And the danger that the Vatican was concerned about was that if you then just returned to a purely political interpretation of those passages, this is back to where we were with the Marxism, that what you tend to do then is you take the Bible entirely politically. You see the Exodus narrative as purely political, but you then take God out of the equation. It's not God who's liberating the people from slavery and take them to the promised land. It's Marx and Marxist models and armed liberation struggles which are going to take those people out of slavery. So a tension between a straightforward political reading and a spiritual reading. It's not difficult to actually say that when those passages were originally formulated either as oral tradition or as written, that in fact there was no distinction. The Jews at the time would have found our distinction between theology and politics utterly bizarre. They just had life and it was completely soaked in God. So as the Exodus narrative was about God doing something, and God was doing something which genuinely and physically liberated people from the actual oppression in Egypt, and then led them to the promised land. That's what the story is about. And that had two layers to it. One was the physical liberation and the other was the spiritual, and they just weren't separated. So that's really the summary, is that concern, getting the right balance between the genuine biblical theology and avoiding the Marxism. And so that's why Camilo Torres' approach is completely rejected. Camilo Torres is just forgotten by the church, and Oscar Romero was made a saint. Now, Oscar Romero wasn't really a liberation theology man, but he's worth putting on the table because he's part of the same package. And you then look at these sort of key players like Gutierrez and Boff. Now, it's not right to say, oh yes, they just sat in the middle, because they rejected the armed liberation approach. So in fact, they were closer to Romero than they were to Torres. They weren't quite where Romero was. They were far more willing to rock boats, but they weren't in El Salvador as senior clerics likely to get shot. So you've got there this the Roman Catholic Church working out how to change the structures, how to be on the side of the poor. Romero did it by retaining his senior church position, being part of the establishment, speaking from within the establishment, and getting killed as a result. Boff and Gutierrez did it by being very much applied theologians and working out different models for being church within that South American context of living and working and worshipping and being church alongside the poor. And the final issue we'll look at here is one we've already touched on, and this is the idea with these base ecclesial communities, that the church just simply loses control. The concern from the Roman Catholic establishment that these base ecclesial communities were in danger of drifting into Protestantism, because what you've got no priest, so it's the Bible, the people and the Bible before God, and there's no priest as an intermediary. They're just allowing God to speak to them in their prayer and worship and in their reading of the Bible, and also no sacraments available because there was no priest. Now, a fairly obvious response from the base ecclesial communities is, well, okay, well, to give us some priests then, and the Roman Catholic Church really wanted to stay with the system they got and have the people travel into their churches. Now, of course, that's very much a Roman Catholic concern. Fairly obviously, if you're a Protestant, you can't see any problem at all with these people drifting into Protestantism. So the first set of issues was very much a Christian versus liberation theology, and this one here is very much a Roman Catholic versus liberation theology, because the Protestants would be entirely happy with this. And in fact, many of the Pentecostal denominations are very strong and very growing in South America. This is exactly the model they use. But there's a validity in that Roman Catholic establishment concern, because some of those Pentecostal groups, some of those Protestant groups, when there's no control, it's just this group of people with the Bible, seeing themselves as before God, being spoken to directly by God, you can end up with some pretty weird and wacky ideas coming out of that, with no hierarchy at all to pull them back into line. So that would be the validity of the Roman Catholic response there.